chapter 30. It's called Détente. All right? And it says Cold War tensions thaw. So it's a little out of order, but at least it's there. All right? Anywho. Okay, so what goes down here is in the late 60s and early 70s, there's a period where there is a real spirited ease of tensions in the Cold War. All right? And it's called Détente. And this is roughly about 1968 to about 1974, 75. And it culminates, it's very similar to what took place in the middle of the 1920s when we were looking at, like, right after occupation of the Ruhr, when they did Locarno Pact and Kellogg-Briand and Genevan Protocol and all of those things. It was more like a conscious effort to be nicer to one another, but didn't really amount to much, and it didn't last long. But there was at least a period of about 5 or 6 years where things tended to kind of chill out a bit. And it's symbolized by a handful of things. The number one was there was a West German chancellor by the name of Willy Brandt. And Willy Brandt introduces one new concept. So you have the third politique, if you will. All right. The first one was Bismarck, and that was Realpolitik. Kaiser Wilhelm II, the bonehead, had Weltpolitik. Willy Brandt's is called Ostpolitik, which means Eastern or eastward politics. Okay? And what that means is that Willy Brandt is not waiting for the U.S. and the Russians to make a direction on this. He says from his position in West Germany that he is going to try to thaw things out with the Eastern European countries, especially East Germany. Okay? And so it starts a process, a dialogue, if you will, of kind of normalizing tensions between East and West. He does a couple of things. One, he visits Poland, and he visits some of the Nazi death camps. And it was one of the first German officials, like in a period of really almost a generation, that had stepped up and kind of like went and, paid tribute to like all of the, the dead in the Holocaust, and kind of took ownership for what Germany's role was in the Holocaust. And that was really big, okay? And the second thing was that he really did try to, say to the Eastern Germans, like, we're two nations, but we're two countries, but we're really still one nation. And there was like an effort that was made to try to increase a dialogue with the Eastern European countries. So Willy Brandt does a lot to begin a chain of events that eventually comes to fruition in 1989. And that's when the Eastern Europe eventually kind of folds its tents and everybody's back to being pals again. Second thing was that Nixon did, not one of the biggest Nixon fans in the world, but this was a really big thing that he did. In 1972, he's the first sitting United States president to visit China. Okay? And that was big. And if anybody's ever seen, Forrest Gump, where Forrest Gump is a ping ponger, and he starts playing, like, in the Gump Mao, like, ping pong. They actually had that. It was called ping pong diplomacy, where it was a way of trying to, like, kind of cool things out a little bit, or warm things up, if you will, between China and the United States. It was part of a policy that they believed, maybe we can drive a wedge between China and the Soviet Union. So it was an effort to try to reach out to China, to recognize China, to visit China, and it really went a long way in starting to repair a pretty damaged relationship that had existed since the 1940s. And then the next thing was called the SALT talks. Okay? And SALT stands for Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. And it was a recognition between the U.S. and the Soviet Union that the nuclear armaments, or the arms race, if you will, had kind of gone out of control, especially in the 1960s. They were devoting way too much to it. There were way too many nuclear warheads in the world, and they wanted to get it, like, tamed, which makes it very similar to the Washington Conference and some of the other conferences that were talking about eliminating some of the naval armaments that existed in the 1920s. And then it all culminates in this thing called the Helsinki Accords, where all these member nations, both East and West, are going to sign agreements to respect each other's boundaries and to promote human rights. which is good, right? It's also absolutely unenforceable, and it was absolutely empty rhetoric. Okay, and so Helsinki, if you hear that name, it's sort of like the exclamation point at the end of détente. It symbolizes all the weak, sort of like shallow diplomacy that went on in the 1920s was also going on in the 1970s. It doesn't really have a lasting imprint, but it is kind of like at least something on the radar screen to say there are people that are making gestures to start getting along during the Cold War. Okay, but then things go to hell in a handbasket in the late 70s, all right? Africa in particular, but there were several countries that become confrontation points between the U.S. and the Soviets, proxy things, if you will. South Yemen, Somalia, Ethiopia, Angola, Mozambique, in Chile, the Allende government in Chile in 1972, all represent confrontation points, where the U.S. and the Soviets are kind of battling it out for what will be the outcome for the governments in these, Latin American countries or in these African countries or in these South Asian countries. All right? The Soviets also got involved in Afghanistan, which really, once again, is it international communist monolith, or is it the Soviets doing what they had already done in the 19th century, which was they had been getting influence in Afghanistan and Iran. That was part of the great game that they were playing with Britain in the late 19th century. But they saw Afghanistan as kind of being like the next piece as part of the Union, and they wanted influence there, and they got stuck, kind of like where we are right now. Meaning like nobody would ever duplicate what the Soviets did in Afghanistan, where they would get mired in a decade-long struggle with no exit point, because surely we wouldn't do that. But they did, and for them it represented Vietnam for them. It started in 1979, and the U.S. treated it as an aggressive move. The big move that Jimmy Carter made to show how upset the United States was that the Soviets were taking advantage of the poor Afghanis was to boycott the Moscow Olympics in 1980. It's like, way to go, Jimmy. That'll freaking show them. All right? So that's what happened, but the Soviets got stuck in Afghanistan in a war that they couldn't possibly win, which was very similar to what the United States was with Vietnam. Afghanis were militant. The United States, if you ever saw Charlie Wilson's War, you know a little bit about the U.S.'s role in Afghanistan. We supplied a lot of their freedom fighters and their militias. Some of them became members of Al-Qaeda. Some of them became very high-ranking members of Al-Qaeda. Some of them were Osama bin Laden. But the United States supported them in the late 70s and throughout the 80s because they were fighting communism. All right? And eventually Afghanistan got its freedom and the Taliban took over. You also had hardcore Cold Warriors-conservatives that took over in both the United States and Britain. Ronald Reagan, our poster child, and Margaret Thatcher, who was kind of like Reagan, except she was a girl and she was British. But both of them were conservatives and Cold Warriors. And Thatcher's big thing was to kind of show off the British strength of the late 70s by getting involved in a battle with Argentina over an island full of sheep called the Falkland Islands. And Reagan heavy-handedly dealt a devastating blow to the island of Grenada, where about 300 U.S. medical personnel were holed up. So big, big Cold War action in the late 70s, early 80s for Thatcher and Reagan. The women's movements of the post-war period, and I call it from Wollstonecraft to now, which is, now is an organization. It means National Organization for Women. But Wollstonecraft, remember, kind of started what you would call a women's rights movement. There's a section in your text that kind of deals with this. It's specifically talking about what women's roles became in the post-war period. There is sort of like a point of no return, all right, where women in Europe in particular are no longer going back to their houses or whatever those domestic roles were. World War I and World War II killed that. The consumer revolution, the need for jobs and everything else, we're going to put women in the workforce in much larger numbers. Women were going to college in much longer numbers. Women were also not spending their entire lifespans reproducing children. Okay? They're living longer. Women were living into their 70s and ultimately early 80s, which means that their life cycle and that part that is dominated by childbirth becomes a smaller and smaller part of a woman's lifespan. So women are like, well, what do I do with the rest of my time? I can go and I can learn a craft. I can get a job. I can go to a college or university and get a degree. And so they're entering the workforce in gigantic numbers. And so it becomes a next-gen kind of movement because women now are, the dynamics are changing. There are women now that are in the workforce and their husbands are at home. Or there are women that are exhausted because they're supposed to play both roles. One of them being a professional or a worker, a full-time worker, and then also a full-time like domestic employee, where they've got to care for husband and children in addition to their newfound independence in the workforce. Then they also get to deal with all of the sordid crap that happens to women once they try to reach levels in businesses or organizations where all of the middle management and all of the bosses are men and all of the women are the lowest rungs and get to be the secretaries and the coffee, people doling out the coffee and everything else. So workplace discrimination, issues like birth control, and other things are going to become much more prominent in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Okay? And the voices of women are becoming a little bit louder. So what ends up happening is there's a pretty bona fide women's rights movement. It starts almost immediately after World War II. One of the, standard bearers of this is a woman named Simone de Beauvoir. And Simone de Beauvoir she was, coupled, if you will, with Jean-Paul Sartre, which means that her philosophical background is existentialism. And she writes a book called in 1949 called The Second Sex. And this is what it says about it. It just says, Beauvoir, who worked closely with existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, analyzed the position of women within the framework of existential thought. Drawing on history, philosophy, psychology, biology, and literature, Beauvoir argued that women had almost always been trapped by a particularly inflexible and limiting condition, and then said that women are kind of situated in this sort of void where they've always been defined by something else or somebody else. And now they find themselves in a situation where now through courageous action, they can kind of define themselves. And that becomes almost like a wake-up call, for real women intellectuals that were reading that and saying, she's absolutely right. We're always defined or symbolized as mother or child bearer or whatever the hell it is, and now we get to redefine what those roles are going to be. And really in the 50s and 60s, they kind of did. Okay? So there's a thing on 976 that gives you a little bit of background from Simone de Beauvoir. I just want to read one thing from her. It says, marriage today still retains this traditional form. The male's vocation is action. He needs to produce, fight, create, progress, go beyond himself toward the totality of the universe and the infinity of the future. But traditional marriage does not invite women to transcend herself with him. It confines her in immanence. She has no choice but to build a stable life where the present, prolonging the past, escapes the threats of tomorrow that is precisely to create a happiness. It is through housework that the wife comes to make her nest her own. This is why even if she has help, she insists on doing things herself. At least by watching over, controlling, and criticizing, she endeavors to make her servants' results her own. By administrating her home, she achieves her social justification. Her job is also to oversee the food, clothing, care, and familial society in general. Thus, she too realizes herself as an activity. But as we will see, it is an activity that brings her no escape from her eminence and allows her no individual affirmation of herself. She's got to define by her role. All right? And she kind of talks about, like, she compares housework to the myth of Sisyphus. Has anybody ever heard of this?
It's the one where it's like an inescapable situation.
Right. And Sisyphus is like this Greek mythology thing, but the idea...
How do you know?
Sorry, yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
But the idea was that Sisyphus would push this rock up this hill, and at the end of the day, the rock would get to the top of the crevice of the hill and roll back down, and the next day he would do the same thing. And so she kind of compared housework to this perpetual cycle where it's ironing or it's clothing or whatever. She says, few tasks are more similar to the torment of Sisyphus than those of the housewife. Day after day, one must wash dishes, dust furniture, mend clothes that will be dirty, dusty, and torn again. The housewife wears herself out running on the spot. She does nothing. She only perpetuates the present. She never gains the sense that she is conquering a positive good, but struggles indefinitely against evil. Washing, ironing, sweeping, routing out tufts of dust in the dark places behind the wardrobe. This is holding away death, but also refusing life. So she's got some stuff. You know, she's definitely got some views about this menace and how they have to be able to escape this incomprehensible void that is their lives. So it starts. And then it's kind of furthered by this woman in the United States. Her name is Betty Friedan. And in 1963, she writes a work called The Feminine Mystique. And what Betty Friedan says is, she calls attention to the stifling aspects of women's domestic life devoted to the service of husbands and children. Housewives lived in a gilded cage because they are usually not allowed to hold professional jobs or become mature adults and genuine human beings. It's another part of that idea that they're always defined as the other, all right, which is very much part of feminine or feminist philosophy, that they're always being designated as the other, and that the man gets to be the one that defines them. So, out of that then comes a movement, and that movement becomes bigger and bigger, and ultimately will have some impact. It's called the National Organization for Women, and that women kind of took their place alongside the civil rights movement in demanding equality and demanding access to things that they didn't have access to. One of those things was control over their own bodies. Remember that abortion was illegal, and eventually in 1973 it was deemed to be not illegal, under the premises that women have the right to choose, or the women have the right to control their own bodies. It came out of a lot of like Foucauldian philosophy from France, of where there are like organizing structures that control bodies. Okay, Michel Foucault talks about those type of organizing systems, and women kind of fall victim to those things. So it was pretty cool and very timely. And then the other, which they were working on, was called the Equal Rights Amendment. And if you've ever heard, in maybe Barack Obama's campaign speeches, women still only make about, I think, 62 cents to every dollar that a man makes for similar work. Okay? So it still hasn't happened. There really still isn't total equality in the workplace. But those are some of the things that they were working on. And it's beyond just the right to vote now. It's beyond, how they conduct themselves in society, what economic opportunities are available to them, how they define themselves in the culture, what they will relegate themselves to in the culture. And so it becomes a lot more liberating on a much bigger level by the time you get to the late 60s and 1970s. Let's see what else we got here. We talked about environmentalism. There is a section in there that kind of explains that. That's just an awareness that I guess people had the liberty and the comfort of realizing that they were in a position of affluence that really was unprecedented in history. But they also got a chance to maybe step back and look at the damage that rat race, towards progress and industrialization and everything else was creating. Rachel Carson wrote a work called Silent Spring in 1962 that kind of spawned this movement, where she started to look at the role that pesticides played and how they damaged groundwater, and they started to give children birth defects and things like that. And it started to lead to some legislative changes. So that stuff is in there. What else? Oh yeah, and then like I said, the Green parties and some activism, and then you start having things like PETA and all of these other organizations. There's like 800 million, environmental movements, now. But there really wasn't much at all up until the 1950s and 60s, and then it kind of begins. And they were looking at industrial pollution, and they were looking at ozone and all of those other things. And then out of all of that spawn came Al Gore. Which is pretty cool. All right. There is a section that is not in the notes, but I want to at least tell you, and that it is videotaped, but there's a section called Separatism and Right-Wing Extremism. And it gives you a little bit of background on what was going down in Northern Ireland, because in the 1970s, it got really, really intense in Northern Ireland. They talk about the IRA, and they talk about Bloody Sunday, not the one that the Russians had, but the one that U2 sings about. And that occurred in 1972, where there were protesters that were shot. There's also a section called the ETA. If anybody's ever heard of this, this is a Basque separatist movement in Spain. And it has now become sort of like what the IRA was and what Hamas had become, where you have these organizations that have nationalist intent, but that kind of use terrorist tactics in order to kind of, I guess, describe that nationalist intent, or to try to initiate that nationalist intent. So the ETA is short, and in Spanish it means like Basque Homeland and Freedom, and it talks a little bit about it. But there were separatist movements really in a lot of different regions in Europe, but that one was particularly volatile. Obviously the one in the Middle East was particularly volatile, and the one in Northern Ireland are particularly volatile, and you guys need to remember those three things because you could easily get a question about that. And then you add Chechnya, then you could add the Ukraine, and there's a couple of other things that you could do to make a pretty good essay out of that, okay? Especially since the Cold War ends and they start looking at, just the dynamics of post-Cold War foreign policy. We haven't done much. We've been waiting for you. Okay. The last thing that I want to do before break, and then I'll just tell you kind of what's left. There is in the 1970s a section called the troubled economy. Okay? And what happens is we're looking at a period where the 1950s and 60s, really maybe the first time in history, where you had about 20 to 25 years of really wealth creation and unprecedented growth and all of that stuff. All right? What ultimately happened was there was a monetary crisis that occurred because in 1944, in order to make sure that they were doing things that would prevent the situation that kind of precipitated the Great Depression, and the fact that they weren't all pitching in together to try to bail out their collective economies, is they created this thing called the Bretton Woods Agreement. And it was a meeting that took place in New Hampshire in 1944. And a whole bunch of things came out of that. One of them was the creation of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. Another was called GATT, which means General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade. They also created the World Bank. And they also created this idea called Most Favored Nation, where they were trying to figure out ways to eliminate tariff barriers, to be able to get the flows of currency back and forth without a lot of the regulations and that sort of thing, so that everybody was kind of cooperating and had, trade partners and that sort of thing, and that currency could be stabilized. And the thing that they decided to do, which kind of got silly, was they made the United States dollar the basis for all currency. So they would print United States dollars, and then they would back the United States dollar at $35 an ounce for gold. So they would back the U.S. currency in gold, which means you could exchange that currency for gold at whatever that stable price was. And for about 25 years, nobody really screwed with it, okay? Except what eventually happened was there were so many dollars out in currency because the U.S. had sent them out to Europe, and Europe's like, well, it's as good as the U.S. dollar. So they got U.S. dollars because it was a stable currency. There was so many dollars in circulation that there were more dollars than the gold reserves could possibly back up. And some of the European states that had a whole bunch of currency in reserve wanted to trade that money in for US dollars because there was a concern that there was too much dollars in circulation and there wasn't enough gold to back it up. And what ended up happening was there was a run on the gold reserves in the United States to the point that I think it got down to almost like, I think $13 billion worth of US gold reserves. And there was so much more outstanding that eventually the United States would have no more gold. Okay? And that was one thing that really kind of screwed everything up because Nixon then says, we're off of that. We're no longer using the dollar and we're no longer going to allow our gold reserves to be drained. From now on, we're just going to float currency, which means the US dollar competes against the British pound, competes against the German mark, competes against the French franc, competes against the Japanese yen, and so on and so forth. And that's sort of what it is now, okay? But by pegging US currency and then saying you can exchange US dollars for gold, ultimately ran on the US gold reserves, it threw them into a monetary crisis, which was going to have a lot of impact, especially on bankers and investments and that type of thing. Okay? So there was a destabilization that went on in currency. The second thing that happened was there was an energy crisis. Okay? And this was set up by OPEC nations. Does everybody know what OPEC is?
Oil producing economy country. I don't know.
Organization for Petroleum Exporting Countries, predominantly Middle Eastern countries, but also Venezuela and Libya and a couple of others. Okay? This is a consortium of the majority of oil exporting countries in the world, and they got to a point in the early 70s when they realized that the rate or the price of goods, like the price of an automobile or the price of food or whatever, were rising at an inflationary rate that was far outpacing gas or petroleum. Meaning that in the late 60s, you could pay, like, I think it was, my father told me he paid 19 cents a gallon for gas. Okay? Which is like, you know, the price of milk at that time was maybe 3 or 4 times that value. All right? And, I mean, it was like that scene from Zoolander, you know, where you, like, take the gas. You know, gas was ridiculous, and then gas was also, it was like one of those things where they believe like this fossil fuel will last forever, and there's going to be no run on it, and the OPEC nations were like, first of all, we need to peg petroleum prices to the rate of increase for normal consumer goods, otherwise we're not really making much of a profit. But the second thing that they did is they put an embargo on the United States because of their support of Israel during the Yom Kippur War in 1973. And that means that you literally are shutting off imports to the United States. And gas prices spiked. And not only that, but it was like after Hurricane Katrina, where there were cars that were lined up in front of the gas tanks because you knew they were going to turn the gas tanks off at like 8 o'clock in the morning.
What was that? Nope.
I don't know.
Something fell inside the...
We got about 10 minutes, guys. Hold it together, okay? So anyway, all of that happens in 1973, and it has a ridiculous impact on the U.S. economy and therefore has a rippling effect on the European economy. And it produced this thing because it was followed up then by the Islamic Revolution in Iran, where a similar like energy crisis hits that spikes gas prices again. And think about the use of gas and how it is utilized in the general economy. And it pretty much is going to kill the economy. All right. So we ended up having like 2 things that occurred at the same time that usually don't happen in economics, called stagflation, which is where the inflationary rates are going up and the unemployment rates are going up at the same time. Okay? And we had gone from a country that was going at about 3 to 4% unemployment for about 30 years to now 12 to 15% unemployment. And in Europe, it was up in those numbers again. Hadn't seen those numbers since the Great Depression. Okay? And it didn't seem like anybody was going to be able to bail them out of it. Like the entire decade, it was almost like Europe and the United States were in this really, really deep economic, dump. And it changed the way that we sort of did things. Okay? We had all these liberal and Labor Party governments and all of this other stuff. And the result of it was going to be the rise of conservative governments. Okay? And really the rise of conservative mindsets. Because like I said, you know, the 50s and 60s in particular were full of hippies and beatniks and a whole bunch of other people that were like, man, free love, save the whales, and all of that other stuff. And the people in the 70s and 80s were like, I need a freaking job. Who's going to give me a job? And the conservatives were like, well, you know what? We've got these embarrassing welfare scrolls. We're going to probably have to tighten up a little bit. And you guys are going to need to get leaner, and you're going to have to start getting by on a little bit less. And you're going to have to start changing because the economy is changing, and you're going to have to learn some technical skills if you want to compete. Because unemployment's a bitch, and everybody's out there looking for jobs, and it creates the rise of conservative government in the United States, the rise of conservative government overthrowing the Labor Party in Great Britain, the rise of really a conservative ascendancy in America proper in the 1980s. And almost in a cool way, the energy crisis kind of shocked people into reality a little bit. That they started to say, maybe we need to design more fuel efficiency. They said that one of the peripheral benefits of the energy crisis is that people were running. You know, instead of being like the idiots that would be in these, you know, if you've ever seen like early 70s Cadillacs that are like gigantic, and then they got about 8 miles to the gallon, and then they had leaded gasoline back in the days, which is literally like spitting out pollution, and that people would drive everywhere because gas was freaking 19 cents a gallon. So they would go from like, you know, Chris lives 3 doors from me, and I get in my car and I drive those 3 doors. All right. But people started taking up jogging. They started to get a little bit leaner, a little bit fitter. They were conserving energy. They were changing technology to make more fuel-efficient cars and things like that. So it did have a pretty good impact. And then obviously it changed the entire dynamic of politics. Europe, continental Europe, on the other hand, did not move the way the U.S. and the British moved. They tended to stay dedicated to mixed socialism and to try to hold on to it as long as they could. The problem is they were pulling hardcore unemployment numbers, all right? And they weren't really able to get out of those cycles until much later. The U.S. kind of was moving out of them by the mid-'80s. Britain was moving out of it by the mid-'80s. It took until the 90s, really, for a lot of continental European countries to get out of the malaise, if you will. Okay? That's pretty much all I got, man, for now. So the outlines, guys, are online. They're in the Google Drive folder. It's really imperative that you guys get on that material and start articulating what those essays can be, because this material, they're really menacing about making sure that they ask questions about material from World War II on, because they think that most people aren't going to cover it. So you got to be on your toes with it. All right. Here's where we are in the reading, in case anybody cares. We are on page 980. So what we've got left is about 30 pages. Yeah.
What page did we start on tonight?
Like 934 or something like that. Yeah, we covered about 46 pages of material. We've probably got about 30 left. So we're going to look at the end of the Cold War, then we're going to look at the 1990s, then we're going to look at the 2000s, then we'll look at some key issues, and then we'll be done.
All right.
All right, guys, thank you.